welcome everyone. I'm Maisha Piotti, and it's my great pleasure to have you with us for the first day of the 2022 Annual AI Policy Summit. As you know, it is important to build trust in AI to fuel its adoption. And in order to build trust, we need to find ways to balance the opportunities with the ethical challenges that AI poses. The aim of our platform is to explore how policy can help us achieve this balance. So when we started our journey together 3 years ago on this project, our vision was to build a global discussion platform that leverages on the Swiss culture of inclusiveness and transparency, our excellence in research and innovation, and our unique credibility in the geopolitical space to build trust and maximize the adoption of AI. Our idea was to bring leading multidisciplinary experts from around the world to share their experience and knowledge with the Swiss AI ecosystem. Another aim was to build collaborative partnerships within Switzerland and with other regions, as well as with international organizations and within the business community, to co-create the future of AI policy together. I'm delighted to inform you that we feel humbled to have made great strides in achieving some of those initial goals. Our community of global experts is ever growing. We have people registered to attend this summit from 81 different countries, representing every single continent except Antarctica. Now, during this week, you will therefore have the chance to listen to and interact with policymakers, business leaders, academics, innovators, and representatives of civil society from around the world. In addition, for this year's event, we are honored to have a collaboration with UNESCO. And we are grateful to secure strategic partnerships and financial support from the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, the Swiss Office of Communication, the Swiss Academy of Engineering Sciences, the Swiss National Science Foundation, and the Canton of Zurich. We're also very grateful to all our other partners who are listed on our event webpage for their commitment, their active involvement, and support to make this event a reality. In particular, Pratik and Charlene from UNESCO, Nidhi and Avinash from India, and Arvin and his team from Diplo. And of course, thanks to the ETH Zurich's CLE team members, especially Samuel, Sybil, and Marion, for their support. And of course, Olga from RegHorizon for her unwavering dedication and hard work during the last many months to help put this event together for us. Now, based on the feedback from the last two events, it became clear to us that whilst raising awareness and increasing the engagement in AI policy was an area we could clearly contribute towards, it was equally important that we broaden the geographic inclusiveness of this dialogue. The agenda for this year's summit reflects this feedback. In addition to latest developments in the EU and the US, this year's summit features expert contributions from India, Singapore, various countries in Africa, and Latin America. Now, this year's discussions will be centered around the themes of AI and future of work, AI and justice, AI and democracy, balancing innovation with building trust, and most importantly, how we can build bridges on these topics between regions and stakeholders to ensure that AI serves us all without infringing on our fundamental rights. We also have exciting keynotes and individual talks on specific topics running all through the week. These range from interactive panel discussions to insights about latest developments on AI policy in the US, the EU, but also the actions that are currently underway on this topic in Africa, in Switzerland, and within the academic community. So I urge you to check out the full agenda of the conference on our website which will give you a complete overview of these discussions. I will now pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Elliot Ash from ETH Zurich, who can share a few thoughts about this year's event, also from his perspective. Elliot?
Thank you, Aisha. I would like to start by seconding the welcome that Aisha has kindly extended. It's magnificent to see so many of you here today. My name is Elliot Ash. As a professor at ETH Zurich Center for Law and Economics, my work uses data science and economics to understand human as well as machine decision-making. At the Center for Law and Economics more broadly, we have a diverse group of researchers exploring the legal and economic aspects of technology and policy, also working with the ETH AI Center on regulatory issues and legal tech specifically. I'm happy to help represent the academic side of this collaboration underlying the AI Policy Summit. Our goals, broadly understood, are to understand how policymakers and entrepreneurs make decisions and to help support such decisions, in particular about AI. At ETH Zurich, we think researchers should contribute not just to AI technology, but also to AI policy. So I'll turn back to Aisha in a second, but before that, I wanted to advertise the central academic component of this summit, which is the workshop in AI plus economics with lead organizer Sergio Galeta of ETH Zurich. That workshop is all day Friday and in the morning on Saturday, and it features a stellar cast of researchers working at the intersection of AI and economics. Like the Thursday event, the Friday and Saturday workshops are hybrid, so you can see the website for more details in the Zoom link. And if you'd like to join in person in Zurich, that's great. We're a bit short on space, but you feel free to contact me directly and I'll see if we can get you in. Thanks again to everybody for joining this week, and back to Aisha.
Thanks a lot, Elliot. Now, before I introduce the next session, I just wanted to remind our audience that our event offers a unique and neutral platform for people representing different walks of life to discuss in an open and respectful manner. And your views are very important to us, and we wish for these discussions to be as interactive as possible. So please do participate in the Q&A sessions, use the chat function on Zoom, and help us to ensure that your voice is heard. Now, please also note that you as a participant will get access to all follow-up summaries of the event, as well as selected recordings of the sessions. And lastly, we would be happy if you shared your impressions of the AI Policy Summit on social media, mainly on Twitter and LinkedIn, using our hashtag AI Policy Summit 2022. Now I'll be passing the floor to Philip Marsden from the Bank of England to kick off our very first panel discussion on balancing innovation with trust. I see that we are slightly early, so that's okay. It's meant to start at 1:15 Swiss time, so that will just allow the panelists to come in. And just to give you a bit more information, the panel features a keynote speech from Zee Kin Yeong, representing the government of Singapore, followed by a panel discussion between an incredible set of panelists whose full bios you can find on our event webpage. So I pass the floor to Philip to get set up with his next session on balancing innovation with trust. Philip, the floor is yours.
And thank you very much, Aisha and Elliot, for your great introduction. And it's a pleasure to join so many people from so many jurisdictions, so many legal and economic disciplines. This is a perfect example of a way of building communications, building trust, and also sharing our own innovative attempts at governing AI. As Aisha mentioned, I'm at the Bank of England. I'm Deputy Chair of Enforcement. We have a lot of algorithmic auditing going on at the Bank of England, and I can mention that a little bit later. But to set the scene, what I'd really like for this panel to do is to focus on the wonderful words of Zee Kin Yeong, who's come here with a keynote speech that I think you'll find fascinating on this subject. Zee Kin, I'm so grateful that you're here online with us from the Infocomm Media Development Authority of Singapore. It's really, really thrilling to hear your views on Singapore's approach to AI governance. And then, as Aisha mentioned, we've got a fantastic panel of speakers, and we do really hope that you're able to participate in your various capacities as participants in the Q&A, in the chat. I'll do my best to make sure that the most interesting questions are asked of our panelists. So we'll start with Zee Kin, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion and then have Q&A. Zee Kin, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks, Aisha. It's my pleasure to be able to come and share a perspective of how we are looking at this whole area of AI governance and the initiatives that we've started over here in Singapore. I'm going to share my screen. Oops, I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a second while I get it up. Right. Yeah. So what I'd like to do is to give an overview of how we're looking at building trustworthy AI, this whole issue of AI governance. One of the things that what we'll cover later is really a brief overview of how our work in AI governance sits within the overall AI strategy. We've studied different ways of looking at AI governance, and we've formed our own view of how we think we can work very constructively with industry to create a governance framework, and also jointly co-create some of these benchmarks and standards when we talk about being able to verify trustworthiness of AI. And then later on, I'll also talk a bit about how we are also moving upstream to see whether we could use privacy-enhancing technology to get better access to data, which is going to be very helpful in both the testing as well as the development of AI. So first, an introduction of Singapore's approach to AI. We have a vision statement of how we view AI, right? And it is encapsulated in our national AI strategy. It is available on our website. You can download and go through it, right? Essentially, what it tries to do is identify five enablers, right, that will help increase the investment in development and adoption of AI. And then we make use of 7 national AI projects to really kind of like show the way to inspire the rest of the industry to follow. Now, of the 5 ecosystem enablers, right, talent, of course, is important. You need to have the people who can work with AI. A triple helix partnership, right, that actually means a collaboration with research, industry, and government, right? Data is of course important. How do we have good quality data, good data architecture that grants better access to data, because data is driving this current wave of machine learning models, right? International collaboration, right? Work that we do in the global partnership for AI, the way we contribute to OECD's work around AI, and also the way we contribute, right, to platforms like the WEF, right, platforms like this, bringing the way we look at AI. But what I really want to dive into is really this progressive and trusted environment. Because when we started this journey on AI adoption, one of the key concerns for a lot of consumers was that the AI as a technology can get very personal, in the sense that it can personalize recommendations for you. It can really customize things for the individual. And sometimes, right, that's useful, but sometimes that can actually be a little bit.
Hi, Zeke. Sorry to interrupt. Are your slides moving? Because we're still on the first slide.
Yeah, I'm just about to move it to the next slide now.
Okay, great.
Okay, so that's kind of like how our work in AI governance sits within the larger national AI strategy. So what are some of these concerns that I alluded to that we identified as we started looking at increasing the adoption of AI across the economy in Singapore? I think some concerns are around the quality of data. if the quality of data isn't good, it isn't sufficiently representative, you can lead to unintended discrimination or bias, as we sometimes refer to it. Of course, sometimes if AI models are not tested properly, it can be unpredictable, right? And it can sometimes misbehave and yield unexpected results. And of course, as AI is used increasingly in automating certain types of recommendations or decisions, right? There is a innate feeling from most consumers that I would like to be I would like to understand, right? How is my data being used, and how are decisions being made about me? Can you explain much better, right? Than just giving me a black box, right? So how are governments reacting? I think we see a huge range, a huge spectrum. I think there are certain, well, in the earlier years, there were a number of countries where principles were issued, guidance were issued. Singapore was one of them, right? We issued our model framework. In more recent times, I think some governments are starting to issue regulations. China has introduced a law regulating recommendation engines in social media. The EU, of course, is looking at regulating AI, especially in high-risk applications. International forums, right? International platforms like OECD, UNESCO, and GPA, they've also put out recommendations. So in Singapore, what can we do, and how are we looking at it? We think that it is possible to work together with industry to translate principles into frameworks that can be implemented, and also to work with industry to start establishing what are these benchmarks and what are these standards that we should be aspiring to, so that we can not just talk about the principles of trustworthy AI, but to be able to independently verify whether some of these things that are claimed by the producers of AI systems can actually be observed. So our journey in Singapore has largely been one to facilitate, right, by providing a voluntary framework. That's something we did in 2018, 2019, right? It is a model framework. We put out the first version, we got feedback, we revised it, and we put out a second version. And the approach that we've taken is that this is at an early stage of AI deployments, relatively early stage of AI deployments. Let's have frameworks. Let's accompany the frameworks with two things. One, a type of self-assessment guide that organizations can use to kind of go through a questionnaire and a checklist to make sure that they are on the right track and they've covered the different aspects of the framework. And the second thing that we wanted to do is actually to put out examples. So we compiled 2 volumes of a compendium of use cases, right? Collating examples.
So sorry, Zeke. The slides still aren't moving. We're still on your title slide. Is that correct?
Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. So we wanted to accompany the model framework with 2 things, right? A checklist, a self-assessment guide, right? And also 2 compendiums of use cases that collate real-world examples of companies with processes that they have put in place that can be stood up as examples of either our entire framework or parts of the framework. We believe that by doing so, showing more examples, it is easier to help companies who are interested in this area to have good examples to follow, to have questionnaires that will guide them in the implementation of framework. So that's something that we did, right? Just around 2020, right before the whole world went into a global pandemic. Next slide. So one of the things that we did, right, over the last couple of years is to see what more can we contribute, right? And how can we build up this whole area of AI governance? Well, through our conversations with companies. So one of the things that there are a couple of things that came up, right, as we engage with industry, and two things came up. One, the various principles, OECD, GPA, right, even the EU high-level expert groups principles, actually there is a lot of convergence, there are a lot of similarity. Number 2, trustworthy AI is actually one of those areas that can actually be put through certain aspects of trustworthy AI can actually be put through certain tests, right? That can objectively try and verify some of the claims, while other other sets of other principles you are essentially auditable in the sense that you keep a record of the documentation and decisions that were taken. But when we dwell deeper into this, right? One of the things that we realized was that we were relatively early in the stage of AI governance testing, that there aren't enough standards and benchmarks, right? What does good look like? What are the parameters, right? Within which, right? When you perform fairness or bias testing, in a particular context, what's acceptable and what's not? When we talk about explainability, how do you select which are the major parameters that you will want to use, right? When you are trying to provide an explanation of how the model is influenced by what type of input data. There was a lot of work that needs to be done, and that's why we set out in the next step. The next step, which is represented by our AI Verify efforts, is to take the work that we've done previously around a framework and an audit framework, right, and to incorporate open source components that can test certain parts. Of the AI governance framework. So we embarked on an attempt, right, to rationalize, right, the various principles into the grouping, the principles that you see on the screen, right, in front of you, and then to also identify which of the aspects are testable and what software solutions are available, right, and which of the other aspects, right, we have to depend on process checks. It's summarized on the screen in front of us, right? I don't really want to go through line by line. I'm happy to share this set of slides later so that we can take a look. Or if you're interested, a much more comprehensive document is available on our website. Next slide, please. So now what we have entered a stage where we have launched an open pilots, right, to get as many companies to come test with us as possible. Because essentially what we want to be able to do is to identify use cases and sectors. For example, credit scoring, HR application, right, or for example, review of CDs, right, or even recommendation engines, right? Identify specific sectors, right, and start testing enough of these models with companies who are willing to do so with us, and together start establishing what benchmarks should look like, what are achievable, and what we think, right, are defensible, especially when we want to be accountable to our business partners, to our own customers, and to start creating these benchmarks, right, using this testing tool as the entry point. And we believe that by doing so, we will be able to help progress the conversation of AI governance, of trustworthy AI, from principles towards something that's concrete, and hopefully in future with something that is objectively verifiable. Next slide, please. So I think I've covered this already. So I think what I'd like to do, next slide, please. I'll move on to the next topic, right? Beyond testing of AI systems, right? We also are trying to go upstream, right? When we want to talk about responsible AI development, I think one of the things that we want to be able to look at is to see how can we have data sharing, but in a very responsible way. As I mentioned earlier, the current wave of AI is really largely driven by machine learning models, right, that require data. Previously, it's always been about sharing of data, moving and disclosing data sets around, right? Is there a better way of doing that? Are we able to use this class of privacy enhancing technologies that has been developed to see how can we do two things, right? How can we allow companies to have better access to data? How can we use privacy enhancing technology, for example, to create synthetic data sets that might help with testing, right? And for example, looking at techniques like federated learning, how can we employ some of these kind of technology where post-development, when a model has been deployed, you can use some of these techniques to continue receiving training signals and to be able to continue to enhance your model, right? So we looked at this group of privacy enhancing technologies, and we believe that this set of technology can help us with getting better access to data, to encourage the flow of insights without disclosing data, and it might actually be helpful. But of course, the technology is fairly new, right? And we are unsure whether the promise of the technology can actually be fulfilled. So so what we've done is actually to move ahead with a PET, privacy enhancing technology sandbox, right? Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is a slide of showing the list of technologies that may be classified under privacy enhancing technologies, right? Based on our discussions with industry, different technology at different state of readiness, but essentially ready enough to start piloting, right? But the key thing is really matching the technology to the commercial use case and then discovering its limits, right? How useful it is, what it can actually achieve, and how do we actually deploy it. Next slide, please. So the purpose of our privacy enhancing technology is really a PET sandbox, right? It's really to see how we can work together with industry to try to use PETs to solve some of the problems. And over here, we have designed our PET sandbox to try and focus, right, the projects that we will attract, right, to cover 3 areas. One, something that we've seen common often enough, right? How do you identify common users in 2 data sets, which will help companies, especially in early stages of discussion, to see whether they should progress with a commercial discussion. It's helpful for the initial partnership, but I think what is more interesting is actually the next 2 sets of archetypes. How do we use privacy enhancing technology to be able to enrich data sets by making inferences, right? But without actually sharing data, and how do we do it well? So that's one way of increasing access to data that might help with AI development. And second, and of course the third use case, how to make more data available for AI development and testing. Next slide, please. So we've introduced a PET sandbox, right? Idea being that we can work together with industry to find the best match. The sandbox is open, right? We're evaluating a few applications right now, and what we are trying to achieve with this sandbox is really, as I mentioned, how do we match PETs with the right commercial real-world use case? How do we discover together with industry as we pilot these applications, what the technical boundaries are, and more importantly, from a regulatory aspect, how can we provide regulatory certainty that certain things and certain users and certain applications are actually permitted under data protection laws, and these are the boundaries that you need to work within in order to be able to make use of it, right? What we ask are that, any use case owner who is actually interested, you can come and apply, right? As long as you are able to fit into one of the 3 archetypes that I mentioned in the last slide, right? What we do to try and support, we are able to provide a bit of funding to try and get the pilot started. And also, if you need to be linked up with a PET solution providers, we do have a few that we work with that we are able to do so. But you are definitely free to come together as a consortium with your partnerships in place. And the last thing that we request really is that We do this so that we can help the rest of the industry. So at the end of it, right, what we hope to be able to do is to create a case study that will share the learnings of the project. And then together, sitting side by side with that, we will issue some kind of regulatory guidance so that people will understand what are the boundaries, regulatory boundaries within which this kind of project can, the PET technologies can be deployed. So this is how we are looking at using PET technology to support AI development, especially in a very responsible way. And I think I've come to the end of my presentation. I'll be looking forward to the Q&A at the panel later.
Thank you so much, Zee Kin, and your slides are extremely helpful, and I understand we're going to be able to look at them afterwards as well. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Kerstin Johansson Baker from the Swiss Federal Statistical Office to get your views, Kerstin, on the various things that your government is doing with respect to this area, especially your competence network on AI and your government's initiatives in Switzerland, and also any reflections you might have on Zee Kin's description of the work he and his team are doing in Singapore, and compare it with your own, if you like. Thank you very much, Kerstin.
Thank you, Philip. And above all, thank you, Zee Kin, for sharing all those learnings from Singapore, all that work. We are in the infancy compared to you. Let's say I'm very much in admiration, and I don't think our CNAI is comparable yet. But maybe a few words about this CNAI, Competence Network for AI. That's one of the initiatives that was started by the Swiss government a bit more than a year ago. It was very much born out of thoughts about digitalization, and of course AI is a key aspect of it. So how can we promote trustworthy AI within the Swiss federal administration, right? Which is very much in line with what Zee Kin just mentioned. We and of course citizens want to know, like customers, consumers want to know, how do you use my data? There's a lot of worry, obviously. So it is very important to start initiatives like that can show what the government is doing. So the CNI is very much meant as an enabler and a facilitator, not an actual provider of AI services per se, but we do provide services like a terminology, a validated terminology. So, as you might know, Switzerland has 4 official languages. So in a country where we already speak so many languages, it is really important that at least in the political realm and within the federal administration, we try to speak the same language when it comes to AI and new technologies in general. What we've also started doing is, and by no means, we don't have such a nice compendium as you have in Singapore. We have a very modest list, but you have to start somewhere, of AI projects that do exist within the federal administration. Really in an attempt to show the public what's being done, what the maturity level of these projects are. And the list was actually just updated last Friday. We're trying to ask everyone. If you look at it, you'll see that it's mostly, for the moment, proof of concepts, minimal viable products. So although we do not have a sandbox per se, I think that also mirrors what's being experienced elsewhere, as in Singapore, that there are first steps everywhere, and also trying what's possible or not. And yeah, I am from the CNAI at the Swiss Federal Statistical Office, but of course the CNAI by no means operates in a vacuum, in an isolated way. We have, of course, federal agencies that are very involved in negotiations abroad about AI regulations, because for the moment, Switzerland, not being in the EU, is a bit wait and see. Also, what has started within the federal government for, Zee Kin mentioned competency, and that we need competence within and in a network. And for example, the Data Science Competence Center has been started also at the Swiss Federal Statistical Office, to have this in-house knowledge to be able to bridge and go forward which is really important when we also about to have a federal strategy for data science, which should also bring some code of conduct for responsible data science and AI, which I think is really important. And Switzerland being Switzerland, not everything happens at the federal level, and you'll hear more about it in the coming days, I believe. But many sandboxes and trials and things happen at the cantonal level, and I think you'll hear about that. So I think although we don't have everything in the same place, we are slowly moving forward, and also to generate trust, because I think that's absolutely paramount for the citizen and for such an ecosystem to be able to exist, right? That, let's be honest, trying to show, here's what we're doing, here's how far we've gone, here are the experts that are available, and the idea is actually to expand the network so that we can bring all stakeholders to have this conversation about AI in Switzerland and beyond, because without collaboration and partners, it's not really very possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerstin. I was thrilled by the fact that the both of you emphasized the need for collaboration, of course, not only amongst government departments, but also with the stakeholders. And it's an area where I think governments, generally speaking, will be at different levels with respect to setting up their frameworks, as we've seen just now. But in my view, at least, industry and some parts of academia are ahead of governments in this area. And so I think that need for collaboration is really important. I do have a quick question for both of you from the chat, which I'll ask, and then I'll give you a minute to think about it while I talk about something in the UK. The question we have is, what do you think of the UNESCO Global Agreement on the Ethics of AI? And that's an agreement amongst 193 member states. But I should point out that, like most things at the UN, their recommendations, not actual real agreements. But think about your answer for that. I just want to mention something in the UK we're doing. We've set up something called the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which is a overarching cooperation platform amongst the Financial Conduct Authority, the Competition and Markets Authority, Ofcom, our telecommunications regulator, and our Privacy Office. And there are some of our first work plans are actually relating to algorithmic auditing and other areas. And I have to say that not only having those different perspectives, very different policy perspectives from different government departments brought together, is helping each individual agency make better decisions. So, for example, you can imagine some sort of technological solution that, say, the Ofcom regulator might advise we do, and then you say, well, actually, that might harm competition or it might harm privacy. So you have the privacy people come in together, the competition people to come in together, and try to find something that achieves the objectives of the regulator in question, but in the least harmful manner, or ideally a beneficial manner to the other areas. And we learn a lot from industry from that too. And we'll have them come and sit in multi-stakeholder events and say to us, we don't think that'll work. And then what I particularly like about that is that you'll have different industry participants. And of course, some companies will come in and say something that's primarily in their own business interest. And it's nice to have other people in the room who say, actually, no, we won't just do what you say. And we might not just do what the government department in question is saying. We'll do something that's most effective in terms of balancing the innovative action we're trying to do and trust. A final thing I'd note there is at the Bank of England, we have decided to dip our toes into the water of regulating cloud providers. Normally this would be done by a telecommunications agency or by a competition and markets authority. But our view about cloud is that it's a critical third party provider for very large banks and other financial services operators. And so, like other countries, we are designating the providers, and you can think of two of them in question, I'm sure, as critical service providers. And rather than wait for the cloud data storage facility to fall over and us to have a mini financial crisis or something like that, which we're quite used to here in the UK, we're putting obligations on them, as Kerstin mentioned, a code of conduct on the cloud providers to attain a certain level of resilience. That's their business model, by all means, resilience, and so that we can ensure their customers, the banks, which we regulate, that this is a safe environment, and then we run tests of their resilience through algorithmic audits. And so this is something that's new in the UK, but it's something that I think does make sense for a central bank, where there's a very strong financial services industry for central bank to get involved. Anyway, let's go back to my question. We had a question from the chat. Zee Kin, you first. What do you think of the UNESCO Global Agreement on the Ethics of AI? And then over to you, Kerstin. Zee Kin first.
Yeah, good question. Actually, Singapore was part, and I was part of the delegation that contributed to the UNESCO meeting that came up with that. I went through quite a number of weeks of very long discussions last year. I think that when we are looking at different principles and guidelines that have been put out by different organizations, I think one of the things that we need to understand is to whom are these guidelines addressed, right? And that will better help us appreciate how to go about doing it. I think a simple example, the OECD ones is very clearly addressed to policymakers, and it helps them think about what are the policies and policy areas I need to cover when I'm putting policies in place to promote responsible AI and develop AI. The UNESCO ones really targeted at the people working with AI. So that's why it's a longer document. It goes into a lot more detail. And throughout the whole process, one of the things that we were trying to achieve is actually to try to be as comprehensive as possible, provide those guidance. But as a document, it is not intended that every single recommendation be adopted in every single case. It would be quite impossible to get any project off the ground if you were to adopt all those recommendations in every project, right? But it's intended to provide a good collection targeted at, as I mentioned, people working with AI, the developers, right, and the system owners, so that they're able to reference this and have a good sense of when you have an international community, what are the things, right, that we've been looking at, and what are the things that we are pointing at as good practices. But fundamentally, I think it still comes back to individual organizations taking that responsibility within itself to figure out how am I going to be responsible to my customers? How am I going to be responsible to my shareholders and board, right, in the decisions that we are making? How do I document them? And how do I, which are the practices that we think are achievable in our context, having in mind the constraints that we operate in, right? I think that's the most important part for turning these principles into actual reality.
That's such a good point, Zee Kin, that kind of humility, regulatory humility in a sense, of knowing our limits and where we need to rely on others is very, very key point. Kerstin, any reactions to the question I had or other thoughts you might have?
Disclaimer, I am not in a unit that's directly involved in policy making, but and you might hear more about that in the coming days, but we do have guidelines within the federal administration for responsible AI, human-centered AI, and then there's, of course, as public servants, right, we are meant to serve citizens and, very importantly, the public good. How that is put in practice can be more difficult, which is also why the data science federal data science strategy will clarify what's meant, how we can put them in practice. But a human-centered data science and AI for public good, that is absolutely central to our endeavors, and in that way very much in line with most recommendations. But I do not myself follow the development of those policies and make sure they're in line with every framework out there. But of course, Switzerland is very involved in all of them.
Of course. Thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to Dorian Selz from Squirro. And we mentioned various stakeholders that we need to be involved with and to make sure that they're around the table. And one of the things I noticed from many cases I worked on when I was at the Competition Authority before joining the bank, I worked on a lot of retail banking initiatives where we used open API and data portability remedies to inject some competition into the banking sector. And we relied primarily in that regard as not only the beneficiaries of our initiatives, which were SMEs, but also some of the entrants that we wanted to come on and invent new products using our data sandbox and the various data we ordered the banks to collect and share. Those beneficiaries also were the fintech intermediaries, or by definition SMEs, that are seeking VC funding to be able to show proof of concept and develop their work. So it was actually SMEs helping SMEs, if you will. But thanks to the large levers of government, and the large data sets of the incumbent banks. Dorian, if you're with us, I'd love to hear your reflections on private sector initiatives and the important, the all-important SME needs and roles, and how best you can contribute to this area. What would you like to see people do better, Dorian?
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor here, Philip. Dorian is my name. I'm CEO of Squirro, a AI company based here in Zurich. And as a matter of fact, we work for a lot of financial institutions and do indeed a lot of work in that domain. Disclosure, we work for the Bank of England. We also work for other central banks like the European Central Bank. And actually, as a matter of fact, we have been sort of on the receiving end of the regulation in Singapore. And maybe I can pick up on this example and showcase a bit what's possible. And so Standard Chartered is a well-known brand in Singapore and around the globe. Maybe not so much here in Switzerland, unless everybody is watching football and see them as a jersey sponsor of Liverpool FC. But it's, depending on who you ask, the largest or second largest global transaction bank, at least in Southeast Asia. And we've been picked on a global innovation program by Standard Chartered to support them in various fields. One of them is where we do today a lot of work with them is their back office, and within their back office of the commercial institutional banking group, CCIB, we help them classify incoming cases. These are cases, I simplify here a bit, as somebody wanting to wire 10 million, say, US dollars to Singapore. If that is a smaller bank, that does not normally happen direct, but it happens through a correspondence bank, and Standard Chartered happens to be one of those correspondent banks. And in a multi-regulation, multi-legacy, multi-language, multi environment, in the best of houses, things can go wrong. That is, it happens actually, as a matter of fact, quite frequently that such a transaction gets stuck someplace. And this is an actual matter of fact, quite costly and cumbersome affair where hundreds, literally thousands of people around the globe are involved trying to fix this, because obviously the CFO of those two organizations that have either initiated the $10 million transfer or on the receiving end of the $10 million transfer are not really happy about this happening. So Standard Chartered together with us started to work first in a sandbox environment and now actually in production for about 2 years, about taking a technology we provide, which is really good in classifying unstructured data sets, because what we deal here with is predominantly lengthy email threads. CFO of company A being angry, going to their bank, that bank goes eventually to Standard Chartered Bank or the other CFO. You have multi-language, very long, multi-threaded emails that you need to recognize what went wrong. And we, in a cooperation between the giant, Standard Chartered, us, sort of the mouse, a smaller company out of Switzerland, have started to collaborate. First in a sandbox environment where we started to test out whether the type of technology we develop will be able to kind of like recognize what went wrong. And if so, then attribute that to the appropriate workflow. And that was a very fruitful experience, because obviously the larger bank having all the data, also having the business pain, and us smaller companies with a couple of innovative ideas have had to go at that. You kind of like leverage, I think, as someone who has built startups for the past 25 years, you actually have the leverage to two key elements. You leverage size and reach of the incumbent with agility and innovation of the small unit. And that combination actually proved extremely successful. We have today recognition rates in some of the product domains, and there are dozens of product domains within that Standard Chartered setup, where we have recognition rates of significantly above 95%. And that is a game changer. That is a game changer in terms of the throughput and in terms of the times to resolution that can be significantly cut, and especially obviously also the cost base that can be significantly cut. And we saw that up live, see what you actually have introduced us to. When we started 4 or 5 years ago, the MAS in Singapore had nothing out there, if I may say, right? And then gradually you came in and started to provide guidance to the financial institutions in Singapore. Initially, I remember that 3 years ago, it was simply declaring what type of AI type of work one is doing, what type of models one is using. And now you see every year you provide a more succinct and actually relevant framework to help guide the work that a private institution does and effectively make it safe. And I compare that initially, obviously, it was a bit of a pushback. Why would somebody want to do this? Hey, let's go and try out. And the analogy I often use also with work we do as an example with the European Central Bank and others in the same domain, I compared it a bit to airline standards. Airlines are super safe. All of us probably here on this call in one way or the other have taken an airplane. Now to fly on 10,000 meters, 30,000 feet is a actually very unpleasant exercise would there not be an aluminum tube covering you, right? Because if any one of us steps out of that plane, we would immediately explode and then shock freeze, given the temperature and the pressure differences, right? And we do that every day because it's safe. Why is it safe? Because it's probably one of the industries that has been regulated the toughest and longest. You cannot introduce any part into an airliner without this not being rigorously tested. And if you don't do that, you have disasters like the 737. Now, AI does not necessarily immediately try to take anyone to 10,000 meters altitude, 30,000 feet, but some of the decisioning that AI-supported workflows can do can have consequences. So I think that combination of try out a few new things, but at the same time, and as an example, do that in a sandbox, but then also have sort of a framework of guidance by the regulators, be that the central bank, be that in Singapore, also the Monetary Authority of Singapore, to kind of like have that back and forth, a bit like the FAA in the airline industry has done in the first 60, 70 years of its existence, I think is a super useful way to explore what's possible, but do that in a responsible way. So I only can encourage the type of work you guys do, both at in Singapore, but also you guys over at the Bank of England that I have happened to see.
Thank you so much, Dorian. And it's great to hear your descriptions of, sort of real world collaboration, real world developments of things. Sometimes areas, as you say, where actually government or the regulators have been crucial in enhancing a development or making a development possible through regulation or through convening interesting groups together. I'm going to turn to one of the money men now, Andreas Iten from F10. We obviously, a lot of these fantastic initiatives, at least in the private sector, don't get off the ground without a little bit of funding. In the UK, we have a fund called Nesta, which we made the banks pay into to therefore then be able to give money to prize winners, fintech intermediaries to develop new proofs of concept. But inevitably their development, their choice tools that they added onto our phones through their ability to access the bank's data through regulated sandboxes was only able to be spread and scaled, obviously, with VC funding. So, Andreas, I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell us what you think about from an investor's perspective, and also an example, if you will, of what are the best things you've seen where you can contribute, or the VC community generally can contribute in assisting the ethical development of AI. Yeah, I mean, if not, I mean, and Andreas is not able to be with us right at this moment, then I can turn to other things. I mean, we have some questions in the chat. One of them is for Kerstin. Is the SCAI only for regulators or administration, or are there abilities for SMEs to feed into that or be involved?
Thank you for the question. I guess it's CNAI that was meant, but
yes, it must be. Yes, sorry.
Yes. So the answer is, it's really recent. It's small with the resources we have. We're starting from the inside with responsibility and a mandate first to look at who's doing what within the federal administration. But it is not meant to remain closed, right? It's meant as an open network and to involve more stakeholders. So yes, ultimately there will be a possibility for other stakeholders to join. We are currently looking at collaborating with another network to get access to institutional academic institutions, and there is also we also have a new node for regulation questions, and it is not totally forbidden for other stakeholders to ask questions. We're small, we're growing from the inside, but no, it's meant to increase, and hopefully in the future, either through CNAI or another node, or it's yes, all people in the business of AI within Switzerland somehow should be in a network, because that's the point, right? I think we've already seen enough. If you want to build AI, if you want to build trustworthy AI, you need to collaborate, you need to discuss these questions, and you can't do it in isolation. So that's really important. So, but we can't do it quite yet. Almost there.
No problem. I've got a question for Zee Kin now. Does the Singaporean government foresee that the currently voluntary guidance to its approach to AI governance will in the future lead to mandatory rules?
Well, speaking from the perspective of how do you make mandatory rules, right? I think the first thing that we need to be concerned about is there a problem that requires regulatory intervention and that requires the introduction of rules. I think at this stage, we don't see something very obvious right now, right? But we do see that there is a demand for consumers for greater confidence and trust in how their data is used. There's demand by business partners that if I'm buying this solution from you, how do I make sure that you are able to back me up and help me provide the explanation when my customers are asking? Are these issues that require regulation? I don't think so, right? Not at this point in time, right? But I think that a lot of the work that we are trying to do is really to just try and see how are we addressing some of these concerns? How are we building those standards so that in future we're able to better explain and better defend? Now, will a day come when regulations will be introduced? I would say that, well, never say never. I think we have examples of airplanes, with examples of cars, right? At some point in time, when it is pervasive enough and issues do crop up, there will be requirements to introduce regulation. But usually when regulations introduced, it's very specific to address a problem. And I think that what we are trying to do right now is to try and build up those standards and practices so that in the future time, when you need to start regulating, well, let's wait for that time. Let's see what requires regulation. But at least we'll be in a better position to say what good looks like and what the appropriate standard should look like at that point.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's so true when you're dealing with a fast-moving area like the one we're talking about, but also with very important ethical issues that people often ask, where is the regulation in this area? Would it be easier if there was regulation? But equally, regulation can set the groundwork for innovation and competition, as we've said. But equally, regulation can be quite stultifying and as agile as a small regulator tries to be. Once it's laid down in stone, it's very hard to change it. And so I think regulation is inevitable in these areas, but it's so good to learn, where good is from each other. And also, frankly, I learn more, I think, from other people's mistakes and my own mistakes. So when governments are actually transparent enough to say, look, we tried this, we feel that regulation is needed, or we tried something else and we feel regulation is not needed, it's really good to show your workings and to be able so other governments can decide whether or not that's appropriate for their market structure, for the concerns they've got, and for their own democratic policy, for want of another word. I just wanted to turn back to Dorian, if I might. What have you heard today so far from Kerstin and from Zee Kin and from myself, I guess, that is not enough? You would like to see more, or where you think that the private sector can contribute more, and we are in learning mode, we're in listening mode right now as regulators, and where if you had the opportunity to address us as you do now, what would you be telling people to think about as your top 3 concerns in a way?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having that unique platform to pitch you what I do, right? Again, taking the example as I have seen it really upfront in life in Singapore over the past years, this gradual approach, I think is really exemplary. I must really say, because it is a back and forth between industry and different government bodies that effectively all of us, let's make it plain and simple, are a bit fishing in the dark, right? Nobody knows what a good set of AI relevant regulations is. Nobody does. At least I do not know. And even though that there are now, say, on the European Union level, some initial and also elsewhere, some initial, we just discussed about UNESCO and so on, some initial sort of guidelines and so on. Real hard regulation is not yet around. To come back to that example of the airline industry, where you have that, I do think this eventually must happen for the exact reason why we actually board a plane and it's safe. Because if you don't, it'll not be safe, right? We all know of, and there are funny videos on that on YouTube, that so-called autonomous vehicles on turning left, one of the bigger problems in autonomous driving, still struggle mightily. And if you go and read the reportings of even a world leader like Tesla, right, what they actually report to the National Safety Transportation Board is that they don't know how to manage that turn left thing. Now, what would I do? What the three wishes? I think one wish I'd have in sort of some of those regulations are relatively vague today for good reason, because we don't yet know what actually is the good thing. I just laid it out. But, it can start by forcing all participants to do a couple of simple things, like what are the methods, what are the algorithmical methods you use to do that prediction? What are the methods in AI you use, right? What's the data input you use? What is the expected output? And by the way, can you point to failures of the predictions, or the prediction is really off, right? Like as an example on that turn left thing in autonomous cars. Now, this sounds like coming from a entrepreneur, a bit counterintuitive, to ask for ever more tighter guidelines. The reason I put this is to come back to an analogy I sometimes use from your country, Philip, from Great Britain, right? Till 1800, and I forgot always the year, was it 50 or 1856 or something like that? You had different gauges on the railways. If you wanted to get from London to Edinburgh, you had to change the trains about 3 times or so, because the gauges were different. So you couldn't have an interconnected rail service running from London all the way to Edinburgh, which obviously 100 years later, we all considered total nonsense. You sit in one of those fabulous trains, and 4 hours later, non-stop, you're up in Edinburgh. 150 years ago, this was not the standard. And eventually the government stepped in, and there was a national standardization, rail standardization summer, where they re-gauged a good chunk of the British rail network. And it is a bit with that in mind that I ask early on to think about what could be the standard gauge, right? To talk about trains, where if once you've settled on that, and by the way, the same is with containers, right? Nobody doubts that containerization was what was the essential underpinning for globalization. Now one can think of globalization good or bad. All of us have profited in some way or the other. Let not the detractors have the field day. And there again, it was standardization, right? We've settled on a certain measurement of that standard container, and everything else is history. So make it plain and simple. Give you an example. As an example, for the European Central Bank, where we have chosen in a competitive RFP to supply them with a supervisory solution, where we help them go through the tens of thousands of commercial documents that a commercial bank needs to submit, and them to check against the regulation in place within the Eurosystem. We have developed a catalog of about 80 or so plus risk models with which we categorize all of these incoming documents, counterparty risks as an example. And obviously this is testing, this is trialing, because there is no standard out there. But in the next 2 years, I would hope that there is some standardization, at least of the container in which we bring, as an example, such a counterparty risk. Why? For two reasons. Number one, to have level of confidence into the system. You increase confidence into the system by its standardization. Number one. And number two, to enable effectively cross-learning. Say, the counterparty risk that we're going to detect in a commercial bank's documents, that is not so different whether it's in the Eurozone or whether it's, say, in Singapore or in Switzerland or in the United Kingdom. They don't all belong to the Euro system, but the counterparty risks in bank documents are maybe not in detail the same, but they're kind of like directionally the same. Even if you read the applicable regulation, that's not so different. So in the moment you have standardization, you can effectively start to exchange these models, as an example. And if you start to exchange these models, not just between regulators, but also within the commercial banks, what you effectively do is standardization, as an example, in their compliance domain. And what you do with that is effectively you helps put in safeguards that make the financial system more stable in the mid to longer term sequence of events. Again, by simply following the analogy of what happened in the moment you put in same standard gauge in the railways or a standard container in global shipping. That would be my wish to the regulator. So not a uniform as in too strict at the moment. We maybe need another 5 years, 10 years to figure out what the details are, but a clear roadmap that the regulators together with industry will come up with a very clear standard process of doing these things in the AI space. I think that would be beneficial for everyone because it gives how you call that in English, Nachvollziehbarkeit. It makes it comprehensible. It makes it fair and comprehensible to all players in the field.
Thank you so much, Dorian. Kerstin and Zee Kin first. Reactions? Questions?
Yeah, no, I wanted to very quickly pick up on what Dorian just said, because he's just given us two very good illustrations of when regulation is required, right? The example of the gauge. Well, we're not talking about regulating trains. There was a very clear problem. The problem statement is it is causing a lot of inconvenience having to switch trains, and trains can't move across, right? And then they identified a very clear intervention, which is the gauge, right, of the trains are the issue. By standardizing, we solve the problem. And then you introduce regulatory intervention to solve that. I think that's a typical example of when I think the usual approach. And I am particularly intrigued by this other example about whether it is possible to have certain standardization of models so that you're able to understand model behavior much better, and you can exchange models to achieve, again, in the context that you shared, right, a very clear result. You want regulators need to be able to make exchange that kind of model to understand and perform their task better. Again, very clear objective and a very clear intervention. And I think that it is as we work with AI, and as we discover where some of these things might be necessary, I would say at some point in time in the future, as it becomes more pervasive, we probably will be able to identify these areas. But it is beholden on us to continue these conversations and continue these efforts so that we are better able to identify. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I've been collecting a range of questions already, but we do have Andreas Iten with us now. And so I'd like to turn over to you, Andreas, to give us the view I mentioned earlier from the investor's perspective and how the VC community may be able to assist in the ethical development of AI. Andreas.
Thanks very much, and I'm very sorry for being late here. I had massive technical problems. I was not able to dial in, but great to be here in that group and discuss about that very, very important topic. So maybe quick background, F10, we are a global investor. We invest into early stage companies in the fintech insurance space. So we deploy quite a lot of capital to young, innovative companies, which a lot of them are making use of emerging technologies such as AI, machine learning. And I'm happy to be here to speak a little bit about the investor's perspective. So as you know, I think there's a lot of money flowing into early stage innovation. And also there are a lot of companies, growing out of this startup culture, which also means for a VC that there is kind of, I would say, a responsibility coming with that. So means, if we back companies which potentially become unicorns and also potentially become kind of the next big techs, that, we have certain responsibilities when it's about AI. And I think with so much power in the VC hands, I think we indeed have a responsibility which we need to cover, as we do when we, for instance, invest into areas where it has an impact on the environment, on social or on governance aspects, as with ESG. And that's why I think it's very important for us that we give ourselves the mandate to develop methodologies of how we can make sure that we get to this so-called ethical AI. That means that we have a common understanding of, the responsibilities on both sides. So not only those who invest money into companies, as well as those people who work on certain things, which could potentially be also misused for certain things. As you can imagine, as an investor, I tend to be not very much in favor of regulation, obviously, because we believe that very much could also kill innovation and new things. On the other hand, when things become more mature and then also relevant, I think we have a responsibility. So at the end of the day, it's a lot about balancing the two different aspects of making sure that new things can be developed. On the other side, also making sure that those things are used only for things which don't create negative impact. As being very active in the more financial sector, I would say we already have a lot of regulation in place, which we think are already applicable for technology like artificial intelligence. So that means from that perspective, there's probably not such a big need to kind of further regulate that. But on the other hand, I think kind of a self-regulation among the players in the industry is something which from our perspective is probably the way how we should treat, at least when it's about early stage investment. So that's a little bit, I think, my 2 cents from an investor perspective. And again, sorry for being a late joiner here in the panel.
Andreas, thanks so much. So I have a question from the chat for all of you. I mean, it's quite perceptive, actually, and I'm sure it's absolutely correct how this is going to develop. The questioner asks, isn't the future of AI governance a combination of stringent AI regulation, i.e. hard law for high and unacceptable risk application, for example, social scoring or surveillance, and then industry research codes of conduct, as has been mentioned, so soft law. But in the case of the European AI Act, how can we make the legislation future-proof? And I guess this also goes to the point I was making about, it's nice in certain circumstances to be able to provide business and investors with clear rules that are hard rules that people can understand. But at the same time, and with the developing technologies, how do you make them evolve with the industry? I'll turn to Zee Kin first, and then Kerstin, and then hear Andreas's views as well.
Well, I think that in the future, right? And I think the examples that we've heard today about banking regulation, those develop over decades, if not hundreds of years, right? A lot of it takes time to develop these technologies. So I think that in the future, right, at some the question is correct. There is going to be certain aspects of AI, right, when deployed in certain circumstances, where testing will be required as a mandatory legal requirements. I think that we should expect that day to come. But at the same time, AI is a technology that's pretty horizontal. It's going to turn up in very many products and services. I think that we should expect to see in the future some form of, how should I say this, some form of a tiering of approaches. There might be certain applications where there is certain expectation for greater accountability. So even if there isn't a hard, what I call a hard law regulatory mandatory requirements, there might be expectations that you conform to certain industry standards. Take cloud services, data centers as an example, right? If you want to be in that space, well, there are a few well-known ISO standards that a lot of cloud service providers will aim for. Currently, is there regulation to say that you must achieve it? Actually, no. I think in many countries, they go for it because they know that it helps them give assurance to business partners, give assurance to customers. So you will find a tier, right, of AI in products and services that might evolve into that stage, right? Right. So I would say that through certifications, through standard setting, you will have a second tier, right, below the hard regulation. We might actually find a lower tier, right, where it will be voluntary, right? So I think that we should be expecting this kind of tiering in the future. And the more we work around and build up the standards, and the more we are working together to establish these standards, I think that the more quickly we will be able to arrive at a stage.
Thank you. Kerstin, anything to add to that view?
Yeah, going back to the horizontal nature of AI, I couldn't agree more, right? At least for the moment, from what I see within Switzerland, we don't really want to regulate the technology per se, and rather looking, at least from the also government's perspective, trying to inform people about what we do, what the methods are, and why. Because of course citizens want to know, but in many ways it's not that mature yet. And yes, it's going to pop up in many places. Sometimes meteorological applications, they're not very sensitive, and you're actually quite happy to know that there is thunderstorm nowcasting. Whereas other applications with very sensitive citizen data are going to take more time, and which is fair enough, and that's normal. So we're probably going to see also sector-specific differences.
Thank you. And Andreas, your thoughts on that point? There's sort of a mixture of hard and soft regulation. How do you work your way around that, or with it?
I think, yeah, thanks very much. I think very good inputs. You know, I'm a very big fan of not regulating the technology. I think this definitely doesn't make any sense. Also, what has been said before is also in something which I would fully support. It's so difficult actually to regulate the technology because that can be used for any different use cases, and it doesn't really make sense just to regulate it. I think Switzerland has made a quite clever approach also with the whole crypto space, and basically it was just applying the existing regulation, with some tweaks and theirs, and also, implementing some special licenses. For instance, Sandbox and also the fintech license is something which I think is a very good example of regulating things without really going too deep into technology and starting to regulate the technology. I think that could also be very much applied to AI. And as I think, it's also still very, very important that there is space to test things out, right? And I think there is this self-regulation approach that you take over the responsibility is so key, right? That this really happens. And it needs a lot of, I would say, like collaboration between the regulator and, those who innovate. Because at the end of the day, it's not something you can just write in a paper and then set in stone. It's something which is evolving, right? There's so many ideas popping up, so many opportunities popping up, and I think it's very important to keep up a close collaboration and exchange between the regulator and those who innovate, because only with that you can make sure that you, at the end of the day, you define something which doesn't, destroy opportunities, and on the other hand also protects, certain areas from being misused, or maybe, create some negative impact. So that's my view.
Thank you very much, and a very good point from Robin in the chat. that the challenge will be to translate the laws and regulations into standards and frameworks. And there's still no mature framework worldwide, as we're seeing already. But for the trustworthiness of the technology, everyone needs to simplify their language with the terminology so that we're speaking the same languages. A question for Kerstin. How do you think the European AI Act eventually and its mandatory rules on high-risk AI, how do you think that will influence third countries? Will it create a Brussels effect? And also, I'm interested in Dorian's views on that as well. Kerstin.
I shall answer from my personal perspective, since
Thank
I'm
you.
not directly involved in my professional role. Let's put it that way. You'll hear more from it, I'm sure, in the coming days from our ambassadors. But let's put it this way. Since the AI Act, the way it is now, affects any EU citizen, you know, even if that citizen is living abroad, it's going to be quite difficult to not care about what's happening with that regulation, really. Unless you really just develop a product for your little neighborhood or your canton, I can't really see how we can sort of escape. If possible, we should try to be in the conversation. And I think the definition of AI is still a bit of a problem, if I may say so. Going back to what we've just discussed, but not my place to say what it's going to be like in the future, but I have a strong feeling that we are definitely going to be affected. And I think there is a lot of uncertainty in Switzerland. I hear also from PMEs, even if we're not directly serving them for now, but yes, that there is uncertainty, and it would be better to know.
Thank you. And Dorian, what are your thoughts about this idea that when a very big jurisdiction comes in with mandatory rules, for example, like the European Union's prospective rules, will your attention be tipping to that as the most largest body of rules that you have to deal with, or will you still be urging collaboration and learnings within the EU from other third-party jurisdictions?
Well, I think I have a bit of contrarian view to Andreas, right? Again, to take the example of the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority. The Federal Aviation Authority for the past 8 years has effectively determined how planes are built worldwide. It has effectively been a competitive advantage to be able to determine how planes are built and operated safely. So what the European Union does here, and we can debate whether the approach is good or whether there are weaknesses in the approach or so, what the European Union is doing here is in a way very similar to the whole GDPR framework, where the European Union also has been the first and biggest regulator and uniform area to impose some restrictions on what can be done with data. Again, we can debate whether the cookie click away elements on any web page is now really a fantastic result of that regulation. It's not. But to effectively force everyone to think a bit about privacy, to think about personal data is good. And see what happened. California has effectively followed suit. They have effectively adopted GDPR regulation and obviously called it a bit different, but effectively it's a copycat thing of what the Europeans have been doing. So I do not think that regulation per se is bad. It has been given a bad name in these more liberal times we've been seeing over the past 20, 25 years or so. But if you think a bit about standardization as such, and I come back to that example about the British railways, it's fair to say it took about 50, 60, 80, 90 years, I don't remember the details, to figure out which is the optimal standard gauge for railways. And in some faraway corners of the railway industry, by the way, there is still debate today whether these 1435 millimeters is now the optimal measurement or not. But it is the one that has been adopted. And the same goes for containers. And we can close the debate because the benefits far outweigh the downsides of it. We get a single railway journey, if you want, not only from Edinburgh, even from Aberdeen, all the way down to the south of Italy in one go. Fantastic. We can get freight moved around the globe. Fantastic. So if the European Union does here the clever thing, and obviously I say that as someone living in a country that has a bit of a difficult relationship with the European Union, not too dissimilar from Philip, your country. if the European Union does do the sensible thing, they will effectively have how you say that? They will have a competitive advantage over the longer term. It obviously also can go wrong if they overstep, right? And we get some nonsensical things probably out of that regulation, the equivalent of the click away cookie thing on every web page. But the underlying attempt to give this a framework will force every other jurisdiction to think hard about what they do and how they do it. And I'd nearly bet you that over the longer term run, systems like you over there in Singapore put in place, systems like also, by the way, you in the Bank of England. I know that the Bank of England, the MAS are super close on banking regulation. They're super close to the ECB. They're super close to the Fed. Technically, say in central banking, what I'm speaking about here for the more general public is already happening. They, for good reason, start to uniformly look at the way to regulate financial markets. Otherwise, you don't get that beast under control, right? And not to say the thing out loud, but the Bank of England had to intervene, for God's sake, for significant amounts of money, not just 2 weeks ago, but a couple of years ago as well. Fat fingers, UBS trader, that's what I'm speaking about, not the recent event of 2 weeks ago, but fat fingers, a couple of years ago, right? That caused a possible. It was stopped early on, right? The Bank of England did the right thing and called the UBS to what they need to do and all that. So disaster was prevented, but for good reason. Such things are in place to safeguard the whole thing. To call it with Adam Smith, right? Invisible hand needs sometimes an operating manual. That's sort of the both sides of the coin I see. And yeah, let's see how the European Union plays this card.
Thank you. I thank you for your kind words about some of the Banks of England's interventions. It's let's just say it's an interesting time right now in the UK. Well, question actually directed to Zee Kin here. I want to ask you just a question that's coming out of a couple of points in the chat about where are consumers in all this? Where are consumer rights? We've mentioned GDPR. We've mentioned how we're concerned, almost like airline regulation about passengers and consumers and things like that. But is there a need, or more of a need, Zee Kin, for consumer interaction, or would you even see a consumer data right, or more aspects of AI regulation handed over to consumers themselves? Or do we always need to focus on the supply side, the regulators and the businesses?
All right. Actually, while a lot of the attention is focused on the supply side, right, the beneficiaries are actually ultimately consumers.
Yes.
Because you think about some of the things that we are doing, right? Bias testing, right? It's essentially to ensure that the model performs well for the intended consumer markets. A lot of the work that we've been keeping an eye on explainability, right? Google, I think, has got their AI model cards, right? I think we've supported different ways of providing explainability. But ultimately, what is explainability but the fact that you want to be able to explain to the recipients of the documents how the model is expected to behave and why the model is behaved in a certain way. There, of course, will be explainability in a B2B sense between supplier and the user of the model. But a lot of the work that we are seeing is really explainability to consumers, explaining to finding a way to explain to consumers in a way that consumers are able to understand, right? Providing them options. I think some of the things that we are seeing that's flowing on from explainability is really why are you seeing some of these recommendations? Providing options so that consumers are able to say, don't show me more from this source, don't show me more from this topic, right? And able to influence. So I think that consumers are really right at the center of a lot of the work that we are doing around AI governance. So I would say that they're intended beneficiaries. Now, can we get consumers a lot more involved? And I think definitely yes. Right, we need to be able to identify the right points in time, the right interfaces, documents, the right conversations to bring them in, right? So that we are able to make sure that the intended beneficiaries do actually benefit from all the work that we are doing.
Thank you very much. Now, a question from one of my favorite countries, actually, Ethiopia. A question saying that AI is crucial for developing countries. And some of these countries have a high need actually for AI to help with food security. And so even if a prime minister is very highly committed to AI, we run into resource constraints, clearly, in many countries. The question from Ethiopia is, and maybe Dorian's going to invent one, I don't know, but is there a dedicated platform that can assist needy countries with this area? Zee Kin, Kerstin, are there aspects of your work where you try to also bring along developing countries with you or work with them, or is that still too far in the future? Zee Kin first and then Kerstin.
So I would think that at this point in time, right, a lot of the work is really focused on the companies that are able to come and work together with us, right? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that's the kind of catchment that we have and the kind of reach that we have. But I do know that there are companies in Singapore that are trying to do work around AI data sharing in our neck of the woods around ASEAN, right? Southeast Asia. So definitely, I think that there is work, but personally, I won't be able to say that any of the projects that we are involved in have consciously gone out. But I would say that once we finish testing and we're in a better position, I think that the benefits must flow beyond our shores.
Thank you. And Kerstin, I mean, Switzerland has such a strong international outreach program. Maybe you're not directly part of it, but do you see ways to collaborate to help with other governments who are trying to achieve the same things, and are there ways of working together?
Indeed, my institution is not directly involved there, and I would be afraid to speak nonsense. What I do know is that from your country, at some point, the National Statistical Office was involved indirectly in an initiative. I am not sure if it was several countries or through specific projects in data science in third world countries to bring the know-how on site. And I know that the UN was at the UN World Data Forum last year. There are initiatives to bring data science know-how to these countries in the hope that it stays there too, with capacity building. That was a very important subject. But I am not personally involved, and I'd be afraid to say, not to be exact here in my answer.
Thanks. Completely separately and off topic in a way, I chair a charity called Lyra in Africa, which helps provide safe housing for Tanzanian girls so they can go get the education they want without walking 15 kilometers and being attacked by a family member, to be blunt. And one of the things that we're doing also is a lot of digital learning, digital technology learning. This is growing incredibly in with charities like my own in Tanzania. And I'm always reminded by the microfinance example from many years ago, where you better make sure that the money goes to the women in these economies, because the men will just piss it away, if you forgive my language. So I'm hoping that there's all more opportunities for VC funding for young African women who are developing these models. I hope. And thank you very much, Sime and others, for putting things in the chat about interesting things to read in this area. Right now, Andreas, I just wanted to bring you in, Andreas and Dorian. We're coming towards the end. Anybody with their final questions, please chip in, because we've only got about 20 minutes or so left. I gave Dorian the opportunity to lay out his stall of one of his main one or two big requests he might have for the regulators. Andreas, I think you've indicated your direction of travel, but let's just assume that regulation is inevitable, Andreas, in many ways. What would you most like to see? What do you think would be best for consumers? And what would you most like to be able to work with as a funder?
Yes, thanks very much. I think I would definitely follow what we have already done in the financial industry, of having sandboxes in place where early stage experiments can be run in a safe environment, that things can be tested, right? That even this can be on a small scale commercialized and see if it really solves a specific problem, and what kind of issues potentially are coming up with in terms of, does it have to be regulated? What kind of things need to be in place to keep it under control? So I think that's one model which I think is best practice already. And I think instead of just doing a huge, framework and then, keeping everyone busy with trying to stick what's in there, is actually creating some environments where things can be tested out in a more lean and agile way. And then the other thing is eventually we have some conclusions down the line of what needs to be defined, then that you get these kind of special licenses, as we also have it in the financial system, like in Switzerland, for instance, the fintech license, that you are able to provide some services on a lower scale without, having to stick to kind of something which is relevant for a big global player. So these kind of a tiered approach of having things regulated and keep kind of the freedom to test things out without creating too much risk is something which I think is perfect. On the other hand, I think it's also in the hands of the private sector, the investors, as well as those who are inventing new stuff, that they stick to a certain codex, like the ethical EI practice, or tech for good initiatives, which I think is also something which needs to be get into people's minds, that we understand what we're working on, and that it's not just happening, and then later on we find out that you have already created the mess.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you all for your top one or two, maybe, public sector or private initiatives that are crucial for balancing innovation with trust. And even if this means you're repeating something you've already said, I'd like to just make sure it's a high level way that we come towards the close of this discussion. Kerstin, what would be your top three public sector or private initiatives, 1, 2, or 3, however many you have?
I think I'll come back first to Dorian, right? With Nachvollziehbarkeit, the explainability, the traceability of what we're doing, even if we don't have frameworks or regulations yet in place. I see the CNAI's endeavor with the list of projects within the administration. It's small, but it's a start, because it's showing that we can actually, they're not model cards per se, but we're trying to show who's doing what, with what data, when they can. And we also are in the federal administration. It's not always possible, but when we can, we say what kind of data has been used, what's the purpose, why, what's the output, what's the outcome, why do you need such an AI project? Would you want to increase efficiency or something else? And I think just being honest as a first step and laid out there is already a very good step, and should and will generate trust, I hope. And that goes with not only a code of conduct, how to do responsible data science and AI, but also at some point agreeing on what we want to measure, how we want to do that, because it's all very nice to say we don't want to have a biased algorithm. That can be also mean very different things in the southern US or here in Switzerland, right? It doesn't necessarily, it can be quite context dependent, but there are things we can also all agree on. So sooner or later, I think there will also be a need for standards, or at least a standardized way to talk about certain concepts, because we need to measure them. Because then that way we'll also be able to say to citizens, look, that's what we do, and that's how we can show to you and prove to you that we've done it in a responsible, measurable way.
Thank you. And Dorian, you've mentioned air traffic control and airline regulation. You've mentioned in a very nice way the description of train travel in the UK. I have a slightly different experience in my daily commute between London and Oxford, but I agree with you. Long distance travel can be quite nice sometimes in the UK. Do you have any shipping metaphors you might give us, Dorian, in answering your question about what you most like to see? What are the best public or private initiatives that you're seeing, and where do you think we'll be in about 5 years? Dorian.
Yeah. Yes, I do. And if it's shipping, if you go to a container port, if you go to the port of Rotterdam, as an example, the largest container port in Europe, they can clear one of those massive container ships in less than 24 hours. And we don't talk about 3 containers here. We talk about 3, 4, 5, 10,000 containers. This is logistics at its best. How can they do that? Effectively, in the moment, the container ship is about in the area at the latest of Spain, so still about a day or 1.5 days out of Rotterdam. The entire list of what's in those containers needs to be with the port authorities, and they start to organize accordingly, right? That allows them to have these super fast turnaround times. Now, what does that mean for AI? Right? The same thing is effectively, my view, 3 things, right? It is transparent, and we spoke about that. CK, you spoke about that. It's transparency, right? What is in that model that you're about to ship and let loose on whatever data set? Explainability. What is the prediction outcome? Why did that happen? Right? And if you go and do fancy dancy stuff with some of the more modern neural networks and you can't, fair deal, you can go and work with that in a sandbox. And the third piece is, in the moment you switch from a sandbox to a commercial environment, make the organization behind, make the people behind accountable. What we want to avoid is these, oh, it wasn't meant like that type of situations. Again, you know, if it is about finding funny pictures on the internet, hey ho, let's go. But AI will have, has the unit economics that I have seen in some of the cases we've done, will make even hesitant organizations adopt technology wide scale over the next 10 years. It's one of those corrosive technologies, corrosive as in, that's the way I describe it. Like the internet was corrosive. The internet kind of like when it came up 25 years ago, I was with, say, the NZZ, the paper of record here, and I don't make this story up. I was with their chief executive officer at the time and the main editor, and they told me in 2001, after the bubble burst, well, we told you the internet is a bit like the oil shock in the 70s, a momentarily event that faded away in history. Sure, yes, we know how that story ended. And what I want to say with that is the unique economics of some of the AI technologies that I have seen applied to commercial cases will be that commercial organizations of all shapes, sizes, and forms will apply this. And I think it's important as a society. I speak here not as an entrepreneur, I speak here as a citizen. We want to make use of this because it has great economic benefits. By the way, to talk about, say, people out of say, Africa, it's one of those great equalizer technologies. You actually made the point in Africa with those micropayments. You leapfrogged a good chunk of the payment systems of the so-called old world, not just by a decade, but a couple of decades. And AI technology has that leapfrog potential as well. But to make it responsible, you need to make people accountable for what they do. So that we, on that left-turn moment in autonomous cars, we don't have dead people on the road, but we have safe traveling on the road. So it's transparency, it's explainability for as long as you simply go and test out things and do things. And in the moment you make it usable in commercial context, you need to make people accountable. Those are the 3 things.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's so helpful. And I just wonder now, Zee Kin, if you have any sort of closing thoughts on everything you've heard and some of your priorities as well.
Well, actually, what Dorian said actually reminded me of how and why we started. Because when we began, we started with this AI model framework, which was based on accountability. The premise was when you put use data and when you put AI system out, someone is making decisions about what functions to use AI, what not to, what systems to use, what not to, what data to use, what not to, right? So there's always a decision maker, and hence there's always accountability. The other aspect of our model framework is human centricity. Because ultimately, we want to put the consumer in the middle, right at the center of what we are doing, and how are we making sure that we are taking care of the consumers. And I think that it's a good reminder that over the years, right, as we have done more work in this, these two pillars, right? These two pillars haven't changed. What I'd like to see, which is our emphasis of the work that we are doing, is really let's work together to start creating those benchmarks that companies are able to achieve today, honestly and realistically, that we are able to start holding ourselves to them. Because standards will only increase once we've established them, right? But we need to start establishing them and establishing them in a very sensible, achievable way. So I think that's kind of the emphasis at this point in time. And I liked the picture painted by one of the participants who asked us, right, do we see a future where there are different tiers, hard regulations, voluntary certifications, right? And I truly believe, yes, that's likely to be the case. There will be certain situations you need hard regulation. There will be certain situations where the market and consumers drive businesses to voluntarily adopt certification because that's what they want to do. It's good for their relationship with their customers, right? And there will be other situations where certain companies, as part of their ethos, right, will want to make trustworthy and accountable AI part of their corporate values. So I think we should be prepared for that. So I think that's kind of like my main takeaway and encouragement coming out of this discussion.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to call it now early because we have run out of questions in the chat, and this has been so rich, and it gives us a chance to reflect on these various discussions. I've been sent some private messages in the chat about how can artificial intelligence ensure world peace and other questions, which I won't pass on to you right now, because I think that this is enough context for us as we're working together. My main takeaways, though, are the need for businesses and governments to work together. Sounds very much like motherhood and apple pie, but I like my mom and I like apple pie. The need for the funders to really be able to understand and have clarity about what's coming ahead. The need for an involvement of broad stakeholders, not just businesses and government talking together, but also different government departments. When I was a competition official for many years, I used to see all manner of cartels and anti-competitive standard setting as well, but I never saw anything more anti-competitive than what governments can do. If the ministry from one area is got a particular policy objective and they just regulate for it without thinking about what might happen in terms of business impact, consumer impact on minorities, these other things. So all the more reason I'm very heartened at the beginning of this summit to hear so many nice examples and interactions relating to collaboration, understanding the concerns of others. I'm sure no one will leave this talk without realizing the very benefits of what we are talking about here in terms of collaboration and having a similar language and ensuring that what does become hard regulation is somehow still agile enough to be changed, but at the same time, what is soft, what is codes of conduct also evolves in a pro-competitive way. So I'm not going to ask the speakers for any of their summary points. I think they've done really well so far. I see no more questions in the chat. All I'm going to ask you to do now is help me thank my panel who've done so well with such a rich subject. I hope you're all able to dial back in at 3:30 Switzerland time for a discussion following on from this one about collaboration, partnership, and building bridges, which Aisha will be chairing. But until then, thank you so much, everybody, and thank you to an excellent panel. And I look forward to the rest of the summit. Thank you very much.